Hello and welcome to Cinematica. In this tutorial series, we'll be looking at Introduction to Windows Subsystem for Linux. So without wasting much time, let's get started. So I'm Joseph Sedem, a tutor at Cinematica. We are glad you are learning Windows Subsystem for Linux with us. This tutorial series is dedicated to Aduma Abubakar, who is a brother and a friend. He reminded me of the existence of Windows Subsystem for Linux when I was frustrated since I couldn't install Linux on a certain device. Okay, so I dedicate this tutorial series for him or to him. Okay. Now, by the end of this video or this series, this particular video, we should be able to know what the Windows Subsystem for Linux is, the versions of Windows Subsystem for Linux, the pros and cons, that's the advantages and disadvantages of using it, and then why we should and when to use the Windows Subsystem for Linux. Okay, so Windows Subsystem for Linux is a Windows feature, okay, that makes use of compatibility layers to enable the running of Linux binary executable files. So this is a feature that comes with Windows, right? So it's more or less like uh, an installation. So you install it on Windows, and then this installation helps us to make use of Linux apps, right? Run Linux utilities or executable files directly on Windows, right? So it enables us to run many Linux command line tools and utilities on Windows machine without installing Linux separately, right, on the machine or doing dual boot or other things. So basically that's that feature. So the Windows Subsystem for Linux is just the feature that enables us to make use of Linux apps, right, without using virtual machines or dual booting our machine. Okay, so let's look at the various versions of the Windows Subsystem for Linux. So the first version, that's the first generation, was released in 2016. That was the on Windows 10 version 16.07. That was when it was released, right? And then for this particular version, it provided a compatibility layer, right? So it's more or less like a layer between the Windows operating system and then the Linux apps. So this layer would, in a way, run when you run your Windows, your Linux utility software. It's in a way converts it or enables you to use these tools inside the Linux. So the compatibility layer for running Linux executable files on Windows. So basically that was the implementation. And then in 2019, the second generation, and that's the Windows Subsystem for Linux 2, right, was released. That's on Windows 10, and then Windows 10 20.004, and then the Windows 11 machines, right? So for this particular implementation, it makes use of the real Linux kernel, right? So this time around, we are no longer, or they are no longer using a compatibility layer, but then they are using a real Linux kernel, right? So through success of Hyper-V features, right? So it means that this time around, there's a real Linux kernel that runs these utilities and all these things. It doesn't have to now convert the Linux commands to one that the Windows can understand before processing it, right? So this one, it runs run the Linux kernel on top of Windows. Okay. But then there's also another one, not really a different version, but then an extension, right? So for the Windows Subsystem for Linux 2, called the WSLG, where the G stands for graphics or graphical, right? So this feature, right, or component of the WSL2 helps us to run graphical softwares. So Linux graphical softwares on Windows. Okay, so basically that's that for Then, so now let's look at some advantages and disadvantages. So for the advantages, the first one is that the Windows Subsystem for Linux provides us or with the opportunity to run Linux softwares or Linux utility programs directly on Windows, right? So we don't have to look at installing virtual machines or draw booting our system, right? So we can just be on Windows and then make use of the Linux utility. That's great, right? And then it also helps us to have direct access to the bash shell. So that's the born again shell directly, right? For running Linux shell scripts. So one of the days where some of us had to use the git bash because we want to still use the basic Linux shell commands, right? While still on Windows, this time around we have direct access to the shell terminal where we can just code directly. You don't have to use PowerShell or any other. Just have our normal Linux shell and then we start running our shell scripts. Okay. Also, not only does it provide us with the local or the native shell, it also helps us to run these Linux utilities or Linux codes, Linux shell commands in the Windows command prompt, right? So this time around, you can just type there. Once you have it installed, you can run the utility files, right, directly in your command prompt or the PowerShell, or you can also use the native shell too. So that's for the advantages. Now let's look at some of the disadvantages. So one of the disadvantages is that it does not provide a full Linux environment. Bear in mind that you're still on Windows. So this feature just helps us to run some of the Linux utilities, right? So obviously, if you want to make use of the entire Linux environment where you have control over the operating system, you can do certain things. Bear in mind you're still on Windows and you're still restricted. A lot of things are abstracted for you. So this is just a feature of Windows, not a full Linux operating system. Okay. Also, the performance may not be as good running on as running native Linux, right? So basically, what this means is that if you have an old hardware and you have Windows on it and then you install this, bear in mind that this is running on top of Windows. It's still Windows running, right? So, and Windows uses resources. So if your hardware is quite old, bear in mind that it works from Windows 10, 16.04 going, right? So it means that if you have a quite old system, you may not be able to use it. And if you're able to use it, your machine may pay the price, right? So the performance wise, it's not advisable if your machine is not, the specification of your machine is not that high enough, right? Okay, and then some of the graphical Linux apps may not run properly, especially if you have the Windows subsystem for Linux. So if you want to make use of some of the graphical Linux apps, then you would have to use the native Linux, right? So you have to look for a way to install the native Linux, any of the distributions at all you want. You can just install that one and then you will be fine. Okay, so now when do we have to, or when do we need to use a Windows subsystem for Linux? So when all your works depend heavily on Windows, right? So you use most of your apps are in Windows, the graphic designer, Photoshop, and all those things. But then you still want to use some basic commands, Linux commands, or do some terminal queries. Then you can use the Windows subsystem for Linux, right? Okay. Also, if you want to use some of the features or tools that Linux provides, so yeah, working on Windows, your work solely depends on Windows, and then you still want to, for some reason, you want to make use of some of the utilities that Linux provides, why not? You can just make use of that. And then when you have a machine with a decent specification, right? So if your machine is quite good, it's not that old, and then the specs are well enough, why not? You're on Windows, you can just install it and then have a feel of both worlds, right? You have nothing to lose. And then for some reason you can't install Linux, right? So on your machine, there are some of the machines that if you try installing Linux on them, you just can't. You would have to make use of some workaround. Sometimes it proves abortive. For instance, if you try, I tried installing Ubuntu on some couple of machines, and then I had this screen, right? Turn off the RST, that's the rapid storage technology. But then I tried and turning this off. I just couldn't, right? And these people really wanted to make use of the Linux. So the best way, right, to make use of Linux, while you cannot install Linux natively on such machines, is to just make use of the Windows subsystem for Linux, right? So at least you have a feel of both worlds. You can do most of the things that you would like to do on Linux, right? Okay, so that'll be all for this video. In the next video, we would look at how to install and set up Windows subsystem for Linux on our Windows machines. So if you've learned something from this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Share with your friends so they may also learn something as well. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you.